I was born in San Antonio, Texas, on Veterans Day, November the 11th, 1946. I had two stepsisters, but I never knew them as that. They were my sisters. My parents were born exactly a year prior to me being born. On their anniversary, I was born there, on their anniversary. We lived in the barrio of San Antonio, in the poor neighborhood. Didn't know I was poor because you just get acclimated to the environment that you're brought up in. The creek nearby was our playground. We rolled down the hill on tires and did all sorts of things that kids normally do in those neighborhoods. And I went to Catholic school for 12 years, elementary school at Sacred Heart, Holy Cross High School. I graduated in 1965. My parents, again, were not able to afford further education for me, so I decided on my own, without telling them, to go visit the recruiters at the post office next to the Alamo. And I went to all the different recruiters, and the Navy is the one who struck me the most. They had the best to offer. I wanted to be an architect. My father had wanted to send me to Tech High School, which was a technical school, and they had an excellent drafting class. But my mother wanted me to continue with the Catholic education. So, Holy Cross, here I come. But at Holy Cross, they had a small architectural drafting class, if you will. And I happened to win first place in a lakeside resort drawing. And eventually, when graduation time came, it was time to decide, well, I can't go to college. What am I going to do? The Navy accepted me. I volunteered for 4 years based on the promise they made me. They promised me drafting A school. So I signed and went home, and I told my parents. And of course, mom and dad, especially mom, she just broke down because it was just a total surprise to them. So that's what got me into the Navy. Had no idea about the war that was going on in Vietnam at that time. I just wanted to further my education.
Wow. Did you get to go to A school for drafting?
Funny that you ask. I'm embarrassed, but this is the truth. I get to recruit training camp in San Diego. And as part of your basic training, you go through the first phase. And when you get issued your uniforms, they've been stored in warehouses and in mothballs. So the young recruits that first come in to Naval Training Center in San Diego, we were called mothballs because we reeked. If we were downwind, they knew we were coming. When we crossed over a small bridge into upper class country, as it was called, we went to classification in an auditorium. The auditorium was filled, and they handed out sheets, and it listed all the schools available. And the man in charge, a chief, a Navy chief, said that he was going to call out the list of schools that were closed. And he happened to say Draftsman A School. And I raised my hand. I said, excuse me? I signed because I was promised drafting school. And everyone started laughing. So this isn't funny, it's just serious. I gave 4 years of my life for school. You promised me. Well, needless to say, we walk out of the auditorium, and the upperclassmen, they've already been through it. They knew the pain and agony we were experiencing. So as we were exiting the auditorium, they kick off with a little jingle. The little jingle went, mothball, mothball, don't feel blue. Our recruiter screwed us too. That's the story. In the Navy, you have rates. They call them rates. And I still was determined to be a draftsman. And that they call them draftsman strikers. Okay, I was an E3 after I got out of boot camp. And when they told me that I could no longer go to school, that's what it was, I told my drill instructor the story, that I had won a first place drafting contest, et cetera, et cetera. And he allowed me to make a phone call home. And I told my parents what had happened, and I asked them to send me the drawing. And they did, along with 3 letters of recommendation from the principal, Brother Harold, and my drafting teacher, Brother Stanley, Brother Edward, pardon me, and the architect who judged the drawing. And with that, I was allowed to go to reclassification once again. And as soon as they saw the drawing and the letters of recommendation, suddenly door number 3 was open wide again, and drafting school was made available to me. But they offered me 2 years on-the-job training in San Diego instead. Your choice. I learned the lesson, never pass up an education, because I was given the 2 years on-the-job training in San Diego, but that turned to just a little over a year, because then I received sudden orders to combat boat training, PCF boat training across the bay in Coronado. That's what happened. That was from February of 1967 to April of 67. Went home for a number of weeks and then had to report to, I believe it was Seattle, Tacoma area, where there's an Air Force base there that we flew over to Vietnam. And of course the training in Coronado was extensive. It was brutal. We went through survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, SEER training. As a matter of fact, in Coronado, we trained right alongside the SEAL team forces. Of course, we just moved aside whenever they came storming by. Those guys were just way beyond our training. Nonetheless, we had an experience interesting that the training we were going to a tropical zone, hot. And we're sent to survival training in Whidbey Island in Washington. Cold. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot in survival training. My ethnicity, Mexican American, proudly to say, got me into a lot of trouble. I was feisty, skinny as a string, but feisty. And when it came time to be caught by the enemy, if you will, we were thrown into POW camp. And it was my turn to go into the interrogation room. And as you and I are sitting here, the man was much closer to me. And the first thing he'd ask was, how many troops do you have? How many boats do you have? All the different questions they needed to, and he said it in an accent similar to a communist-styled accent, intimidating. And immediately, according to what we had learned the week past, was that you give your name, your rank, your service number, your date of birth, and that's it, according to the Geneva Conventions. And so I looked him straight in the eye and responded that way. Well, just as I was finishing, he punched me in my chest and threw me up against the wall. It was right behind me. I was sitting on, not a chair, but a configured 2-piece 2x4 in form of a T, and you had to balance yourself on, and that's what it was. That just tore me up. I got up from that floor immediately, and I just looked at him like I was going to attack, and he said, "Sit!" And so I sat. But I leaned into him, and he kept asking me more and more questions, and I kept repeating, "Raul Herrera, SSN," boom, this time in the face. Punched me down again. This went on about maybe 3 more times. Finally, on that last time, he stood up and looked over me as I was on the floor, and he called an end to the training, to the program. He put a pause to the program, and he spoke in regular English. And he says, "Don't ever do that. If you're captured by the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese, don't ever do that. Don't ever fight them, because all they want to do is take the fight from you." I said, "Oh." So that ended that particular event, but I learned a great deal. And of course, we were without food for a week. We were without food, and you start hallucinating. You start thinking wild things. And then, of course, there was an intimidating man, the sergeant major. He was a tall, I believe he had to have been Native American, but he was tall and he was a brute. And he played the role of the sergeant major quite well. When we were captured, before going into the prisoner of war camp, we were stripped down to our shorts. Pardon me, in the Navy, they're skivvies, if you will, for accuracy here. And they were making sure that we had no paraphernalia, nothing, contraband, weapons, etc. And they marched us out into the courtyard, and it must have been a corral at one time, because there were horse stalls, open horse stalls to one end, and one by one we were marched into those horse stalls. And there was a puddle where the horses had been, and it was icy water, and we were thrown into it. I was thrown into that puddle. And the only thing I had on besides my skivvies and my boots was a night knit watch cap that the Navy issues. The sergeant major came, and I had my dog tags hanging from my neck, but I also had my, as a matter of fact, if I may, I still have it, my St. Anthony medal that my parents had given me when I left for Vietnam at the airport. And so when the sergeant major approached and he saw that, he grabbed and he just uttered some obscenities, totally degrading my faith and so on. And the next thing I knew, I was flat on my back in that puddle. And the sergeant major put his heavy boot up on my chest. He pushed it up, pulled my watch cap over my face, and poured water up my nose till I was just about to drown. I was thrashing everywhere. Eventually, more torture went on, and kicking and so on. And finally, he kept asking questions, and again, I kept repeating. Seaman Raul Herrera, serial number again. The sergeant major turns around to his goonies and says, "Kill him." So the two goonies that he had with him grabbed me by my ankles upside down and crashed me through a thin layered ice, 50-gallon barrel drum, and shoved me down into the water. And I thought, by that time, with nothing to eat for a week, you're delirious, you know you're going to die. And so they pulled me out in time. But that was very traumatic, very, very traumatic. So. They flew us to Cam Ranh Bay, and there was a swiftboat base nearby. And we were sent there because from that location, they sent the crews to different locations in Vietnam. And each crew, by the way, was made up of 6 individuals, 5 enlisted men and 1 junior boat officer. And so the crews were, you trained as a crew. I was part of Crew 74 Alpha in Coronado, and we stayed together as a crew. However, we were missing 1 crewman, and we picked him up off once we got in country, as they say, in Vietnam. And the Swiftboat organization already had bases established in Da Nang, which was Coastal Division 12. Chu Lai was Coastal Division 16. Queen Yon, Coastal Division 15. Cam Ranh Bay, Coastal Division 14. Cat Lo, near Saigon, that was Coastal Division 13. And in An Thoi, that was Coastal Division 11.
And which one were you sent to?
We were sent to Da Nang. We were flown to Da Nang.
Up north.
Up north. And from there is where we trained with experienced crews. We went out individually. For example, I was sent as a radioman. That was my job on the Swiftboat. Again, I'm a draftsman striker. There was no drafting table on the Swiftboat. There was a combat chart table, but no drafting table. So I learned radio and radar, and those were my duties. And so I was sent out on a crew that I didn't know, but I had to shadow the radarman, and see what his job was, his pre-patrol activities, etc. And that went on for about a week. And then we got together as a crew, and we went out with an experienced boat officer that he guided us through. And of course, they would send us out to just on the outside of the base, on the harbor, basically, to do our patrol, to get our feet wet, if you will. And once that was established, then we received orders to go south to Chulai for temporary duty. Well, that turned into a full year. We stayed there in Chulai. And we had an interesting crew. Our boat officer was Lieutenant Bergen, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Bergen. Our lead petty officer was Bobby Don Carver, boatswain first class Bobby Don Carver. Next in line was our engineman first class Ronald Reinhardt. Our gunner was a torpedoman, third class, Robert Middleton. I was the radioman, and the seaman that we picked up in Da Nang was Timothy McNamara. I had an interesting story to tell about the boatswain mate. In today's world of 2019, so many things are politically correct. But my boatswain mate knighted me with the moniker of Bean. Not acceptable in today's time. But in today's time, I like it when people call me Bean, especially my fellow Vietnam vet brothers, because Carver, when I first met him in swiftboat training, when we came together as a crew, when I approached him and Mr. Bergen, they were already standing there in the group, he looked me up and down. And he looked and he twirled his reddish handlebar mustache and kind of rubbed his belly a little bit. And he says, "What's going on, Bean?" I was shocked a little bit, but knowing his height and his posture, I wasn't about to attempt to try to do anything else, but just not respond. In fact, it reminded me. It was an issue of ethnicity for me. It was shocking because in San Antonio, I grew up in the barrio, and we were all accustomed to each other, and we lived within the confines of the barrio. So our ethnicity was never in question. But suddenly I'm having to face this shocking remark by this man. It reminded me of when I went to register for the selective service, filling out the forms, and there were many. There was a black sergeant with a little Smokey the Bear hat on and with a stubby cigar that he was smoking. And he told us, if you have any questions, raise your hand. Well, right out of the chute, I raised my hand. He marches over and he looks down at me and says, What's your question, son? I said, "Sir, I don't see where to check for Mexican." God's honest truth. Call it naive, whatever it was. I was happy being called a Mexican. Mexican-American, preferably, but that's what I felt we were. American first, but proud of our heritage and therefore Mexican because I came out of the barrio. He shook his head and says, "Son, just check Caucasian." Oh, that left me in worse problems because what the heck is a Caucasian? No one ever told us that, we didn't have lessons in ethnicity at school. But nonetheless, I dealt with it. I was Bean from then on. Well, not only was I the radio and radarman, I was also responsible for cooking. We were on 24-hour patrols. I'm talking now that we're in Chulai. We're an established crew, and we're going out. There were, let's say, possibly 3 or 4 patrol areas out of Chulai. Each boat had a certain range of distance, 2 or 3 miles along the coast. Vietnam, the South Vietnam, we patrolled 1,200 miles of coastline in all those different divisions, all those coastal divisions that we had to secure. Swift boats were 50-foot aluminum-hulled boats that were almost shelf-ready to some degree. How did swift boats come about? In 1965, up until 1965, the United States was already involved in the Vietnam conflict to a certain degree. And there was always suspicion that North Vietnam was resupplying their forces through the sea. And there was even some of our own Navy military folks didn't quite believe that. They felt that the arms were coming through inland. They were coming inland from the north. On February the 16th, 1965, Lieutenant Jim Bowers, Army helicopter pilot, was asked to fly a medevac mission from Quy Nhon to the field to pick up a Special Forces officer that had been wounded. Not critically, but wounded. And so he did. He picked him up, and he flew out towards the coast. The conditions were the low ceiling, so he was going toward the coast where he could ride the shoreline safely south, and he was headed towards the 8th Field Hospital in Nha Trang. As he was getting close to that point, he needed to veer to the southwest over Vung Ro Bay Peninsula. The bay was a interesting bay. It wasn't open to the sea. There was a peninsula that paralleled the shoreline that hid the bay. So as he's flying over Cape, there was a peninsula that he flew over. As he flew over, him and his co-pilot, they took a second look down on the water, and they swore they saw a moving island. So they circled around and went lower, and as they approached what they thought was an island, trees, they started getting enemy fire from it. It was a trawler. It was a fishing trawler, an ammo-laden fishing trawler, camouflaged with palm trees and shrubs and everything. And that was the first time the proof that the North was resupplying their troops by the sea. That finding, the trawler at Vung Ro Bay, was the catalyst for the creation of Operation Market Time, Task Force 115. And Task Force 115 was delegated the responsibility of coastal patrol, preventing enemy infiltration from the sea. That's where swift boats came in. And it was fast-tracked, very, very fast-tracked. Prior to swift boats coming in country, the Coast Guard, with their 85-foot WPBs, Coast Guard cutters, were modified with mortars and additional armament and shipped over. 17 Coast Guard cutters made it to Da Nang and to An Thoi. So they were the first smaller craft in the Vietnam conflict. However, there was a special need a greater need rather, to have a smaller craft to be closer inshore. And the search began. And they found a boat that was already in use in the Gulf of Mexico. Seaward Seacraft out of Berwick, Louisiana, I believe. They had these boats manufactured for the oil companies. They only had the pilot house, and the back was just a flat deck, and that's where they transported pipe, equipment, supplies, and men as well from shore to the oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. So a contract was let out to the Seaward Seacraft to manufacture 101 Mark I swift boats. And that's how eventually the first swift boats, PCF-3 and PCF-4, made it to An Thoi at the south of Vietnam. An Thoi is part of the island of Phuoc Island at the southern tip of Vietnam. And so they went there. And coming out of the LST that took them there, they didn't have time to rest because they had a special call for fire support from a special forces base. So immediately they were put into action, and they were successful right from the beginning. The unfortunate story behind PCF-4 is that on February the 14th, Valentine's Day, the Swiftboat family in market time had their first loss. PCF-4 and the crew fell victim to a booby trap. The Viet Cong had placed a Viet Cong flag on a flotsam anchored down to the bottom, shallow. And they were within 100 yards from shore, and the waters were rather shallow. The crew had already taken down a flag before, and they just considered that it was just harassment by the enemy. You looked ashore, and you saw no one. So the enemy is letting you know that we're here, and you don't see us. It's a harassment move. Well, this day, they approached it, and the crew decided to, let's lob some grenades. Let's see if we can send off a secondary charge. Let's be careful. They did a number of times, right on top of that location, nothing. So they approached. As they approached from the starboard side of the swift boat, the seaman grabbed a knife, and as he was cutting the lanyard off that flag, the explosive mine detonated, sending the boat up and the crew along with it, killing 3 men immediately and mortally wounding another. Only 2 survived. Out of the 6, only 2 survived. So that taught us a lesson. These first boats and crews that went over there, they were actually writing the operations manual for actual field combat for our swift boats. And they were lessons learned that while we were in training, we heard about those tragedies as well. So, and then of course in Chulai we had at least four patrol areas that we took care of in our area. And so my duty as a radioman was to continue my flashing light lessons. We were given a little square, a little black square, something about maybe this big. And you squeezed it, and it was a circle that had little slots. It was black, but behind it was white. So when you did this, you could see that it was flashing light. And that was my duty and responsibility. There's a story that goes with that. Later on, towards the end of my tour, we were on patrol with a new boat officer. And he called us all to general quarters. I mean, this boat officer was very, very young, inexperienced completely. And he called us all out of sleep. It was during the middle of the night. He called us out, general quarters. There's a trawler coming. So we did the machine guns. We got ready to open fire on this vessel. And I looked at the radar. I said, "Sir, that's an LST. It's a transiting LST, sir." No, man your battle stations. I said, "Sir, it's an LST. It's transiting south to north. It's going to Da Nang." And says, well, send him some flashing light. I said, uh-oh, flashing light? Well, I grabbed a light that has a trigger, and I clicked, dit, dotted it, did it, dit, dotted it, did it, dit. And so the man on the LST, he flashes something back. And so the boat officer tells me, "Well, what do you say? What do you say?" He says, well, I don't know. He says, what do you mean you don't know? He says, what did you send him? I said, Eddie. He says, Eddie? What do you mean, Eddie? So, well, yes, sir, that's the only flashing light I know, because when I was in San Diego, there was a radio man friend of mine that everywhere we went on base, his name was Eddie, and he was practicing flashing light, and he kept saying, did, dotted it, did it, did. So, anyway, it was just one of those comical things that, it wasn't all ducking bullets and, agony. And there was a few things that, became comical, but that was one of them. So in addition to my radio and radar duties, I was a cook. And so in the mornings before patrol, I'd have to go to the commissary and pick up stores. I'd usually ask my boat officer what he wanted. And I'd pick up sandwiches or steaks or whatever. Oftentimes, we'd come alongside bigger ships, destroyers, and they'd give us ice cream, or they'd give us steaks, or sometimes they'd give us lobster, or whatever it was. So we ate well when we could, when the seas were favorable, and we could, anchor off in the cove somewhere and eat. But other than that, we usually had sandwiches. We'd have sandwiches, and I don't remember clearly, but fellow crew members tell me that we'd had soda pop as well, canned soda, or what the guys called bug juice, which was Kool-Aid, usually red. But that was my duty. Of course, when we each had our own duties prior to going on patrol, the engineman took care of his engines, warmed them up. I checked the radar, radio, communications, made sure we had the proper chart for the patrol area we were going to. The seaman made sure that we packed all the stores, everything was stored away properly, and the lights were working, the running lights for night vision and so on were working. So we all had our responsibilities. The gunner made sure we had ammunition, mortars. On the swift boat, on the top of the pilot house, we had what we called a gun tub. And on that gun tub, we had a pivoting twin 50 caliber machine gun arrangement. On the fantail, we had an 81 millimeter mortar with a single 50 caliber machine gun mounted on top, piggyback fashion they called it. This mortar was unique in that it had the capability of your standard drop and fire mode, or you could hand load it, put it in trigger fire mode, hand load it, level it off, and fire. So that's basically what my duties were.
Very good. Now, how many swift boats were at Cuchi?
At Chulai.
Chulai, sorry.
At Chulai, we had in the range of maybe 12 to 15 swift boats. It varied because of engine problems, or one boat had to be taken somewhere else for repair. Chulai was not as big as Da Nang. Da Nang was the main repair location. Out of Da Nang, there were also other small detachments in Viet and in Hue, up north of Da Nang. There were two locations. But in our area, again, at any one time, 10 swift boats at the minimum.
And did you get to be pals with all of the different crews, or did you kind of stick to your crew, or how
Well,
that work?
yes, we did have camaraderie. We had we'd patrol for 24 hours, and then we'd come back in for 24.
And what would you do for your 24 off?
We happened to be fortunate. Right outside our barracks was the Straw Elephant. It was a enlisted men's club. The young crewmen up to, let's say, E3 rating could go to this particular club, referred to as the EM club, enlisted men's club. The higher up petty officers, second class, first class, they had the AC Doocy club, a different part of the base. And of course, the officers, the chiefs had their own club as well, and then the officers had their own club. So the Straw Elephant was just right outside our barracks. And it was like a native African hut of sorts, because the roof was made out of thatch. open to the sea. And of course, we had the USO shows coming by. A lot of bands out of the Philippines, young lady bands, and it was a hoot. It was a hoot. We let our hair down. Mentioning hair brings up another interesting thing. In Da Nang, everything was the uniform of the day. You had to be in your denim bell bottoms, your boondockers, your chambray shirts, like as I'm wearing now, similar to that, your navy hat, etc. In Chulai, it was totally different. We were, not that we were rebellious of sorts, but the minute we were out on patrol, or even before, we'd take off our basic uniform and put on our shorts, and we'd walk around the boat with our flip-flops, no shirt. And I've got one picture that was taken of me where I borrowed a fish from one of the fishing junks that we were inspecting, and for some reason, I don't know why, but we had a rod and reel, deep sea type fishing rod and reel, and I took a picture. I borrowed the fish, big. It was a big fish, and I hooked him and I stood with my rod and reel, and I've got my shirt similar to this, wide open. No, it wasn't buttoned down. I had you basically call them Daisy Duke type. They were short, and my boondockers, and my hair was like that young boy that Tarzan had, Bamba. Was it Bamba? Right? It was all curly and just completely not appropriate. And I said, "Oh God, did I get it?" And that's basically how a lot of us were. We'd come alongside of a destroyer, an official blue water Navy type, and the boat officers up above would yell at us to, get into the uniform of the day, and we'd give them a certain salutation sign. That's how we were. We were a strange group of sailors on the edge, but we knew what we were doing, and we did our job well. Things that take me back there, besides music, if I may, in terms of flashbacks, when you hear of veterans, not necessarily just of the Vietnam War or any other war, flashbacks are real, and there's certain things that trigger those flashbacks. For me, one of the things that triggers me back immediately is the smell of diesel fumes, diesel engine fumes. Our Swift boat was powered by two Detroit diesels, V12 engines. And that certain smell that comes, if you're ever trailing behind a 18-wheeler, you can smell that diesel, or a dump truck or something. You can smell, and that immediately takes me back, because that's on our Swift boat dock. That's all you could smell, diesels. Another thing that triggers me, like many of the ground troops, is the sounds of helicopter blades. It's just your first instinct is to look up and look for the bird, and it just takes you back, because you've left so many memories there and came back with so many memories as well. But as far as music is concerned, while in training, the song that rings most to me is the Buffalo Springfield, For What It's Worth. That was very popular, that group Buffalo Springfield. And it's interesting because it was very much associated with the war protest movement. I must say this, prior to going over to Vietnam, I still wasn't very much in tune to the war protesting movement. It really hadn't kicked off. It was started. I believe in doing research, I've learned that the SDS group, I think it was called, got it started around that time, and there was a lot of protests starting. But I, being in the base in Coronado, at the Naval Amphibious Base in Coronado, and concentrating on our training, we really didn't paid too much attention, and we weren't faced with any protesters, so it wasn't that obvious to us. But interesting about that song, Buffalo Springfield's For What It's Worth, there's something happening here, and so on. If you know the lyrics, that it motivated, it was almost like an anthem for the protest folks. It turns out that no, it wasn't about protesting Vietnam at all. It was about a protest, yes, but it was a protest about the curfews at the Strip, Hollywood, the Hollywood Strip. The policemen, because the kids were getting rambunctious and just roaming the streets at night, and the city council decided to put a stop to it, so they put a curfew. The kids rioted. Buffalo Springfield happened to be at the Strip for a performance or whatever, and saw all the commotion and everything else, and they saw the police, and that's the truth behind that particular story. Yes. Well, the best day is actually an afterthought, if you will, of the previous events leading up to this best day, if you will. Again, as I mentioned, Operation Market Time was designed to prevent the infiltration of enemy ships resupply ships from the north. Prior to that Vung Ro Bay incident that I mentioned earlier, it was discovered later on in research after the war that the North had, up until that time that Vung Ro trawler was discovered, they had already had 122 resupply missions coming into South Vietnam. A very little known fact. And they had a well-established infiltration group in Vietnam. And they first started with small boats, then they expanded and eventually wound up with huge 120, 130-foot steel hull trawlers. We were the last line of defense. We were along the shore, from shore to maybe 3 miles out. Further out were the WPBs, the Coast Guard cutters. Beyond that were destroyers, MSOs, minesweepers, and so on. On July the 11th, 1967, a surveillance aircraft out of Cam Ranh Bay was patrolling along the coast in the Chu Lai area, and they spotted a suspicious contact. And they went down, and it's called, they rigged the contact. That's the term used by these aviators, naval aviators. Commander Branscombe, Max Branscombe, took the plane down and approached the vessel from stern. And he had his cameraman ready to take pictures. As it turned out, it was a steel hull trawler. And what made it suspicious was that it was heading perpendicular to the shoreline, south of Chu Lai, in an area called, the province was Quang Ngai Province. That location is where the village of My Lai is located, and also the Batangan Peninsula is located there at the mouth of the Song Saki River. There was no port, and this vessel was heading straight towards that area. So that was cause for alert. And sure enough, they took pictures. They radioed Saigon, Market Time headquarters. And Saigon headquarters radioed Da Nang headquarters, Commander Charles Steffen. He was in charge of the Northern Surveillance Group. And that sent his unit into red alert, because anytime a vessel is heading towards shore, and we were expecting to confront trawlers, he ordered the USS Wilhoit destroyer, Commander Hayes was the captain, to intercept this vessel, approach it from the horizon, and at first light the following morning, approach it, circle it, take pictures, identify it, etc. And the Wilhoit was a radar picket ship. its mast, its radar unit way up the mast. And so it was more definite that this vessel was a little bit going beyond suspicious. It was a trawler. So Da Nang reported to Saigon, so on and so forth. After the destroyer, the Wilhoit, took pictures of the trawler, it circled it and went back towards the shoreline because the trawler had turned around and gone further out to sea. So the Wilhoit made believe as it was going back to the Vietnam coastline, the shoreline, and it didn't. All it did was it went beyond the horizon because this trawler, this vessel, didn't have radar. As a matter of fact, it wasn't even flying any flag of origin, making it even more suspicious. It had crates on the deck and so on. It was a 120-foot steel-hulled trawler, olive drab, green, olive drab type color. And so Saigon ordered the Wilhoit to continue shadowing this vessel as it continued going further out. The vessel eventually wound up anchoring east of the Paracel Islands, a great distance from the Vietnam coast. And again, the destroyer, the Wilhoit, just laid beyond the horizon, just watching it, cat and mouse game, cat and mouse game. And it stayed there for a good while. On the 14th of July, 1967, the trawler raised anchor and made its way back towards the coast. The destroyer, the Wilhoit, continued shadowing it. When the destroyer, the Wilhoit, first made contact with it, it was on the morning, it was past midnight on July the 12th. The radarman on the Wilhoit gave it the name Skunk Alpha because in the Navy, any unidentified contact is called a skunk. In the Air Force, I believe they call it a bogey at 2 o'clock, for example. Well, this was a skunk, and this was the first one of the day, Alpha. The second one, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and on down the line. And so that's where this particular vessel was codenamed Skunk Alpha. So the shadowing continued all the way. Then the commander, Stefan, in Da Nang, started formulating a intercept mission. There was suspicion because where it was first detected that it would be coming south of Chu Lai, our patrol areas. And by that time, our boat officer was well known for knowing the area like the back of his hand. So he volunteered us for the mission. We didn't know, the crew didn't know at that time that he had done that. Commander Stefan organized an intercept plan consisting of the Wilhoit, the destroyer, the USS Gallup that had just come to the patrolling areas in Da Nang. The Gallup is a gunboat, by the way. It's got turbine engines, fast-moving vessel, race car of the Navy. And there was a need for another vessel, the psychological warfare officer for I Corps, the Northern Corps of sector of Vietnam. He went to Commander Stefan and suggested that a PSYOPs team, psychological operations team, a speaker team, be made part of the mission so that in case they had to approach this vessel, they could use their speakers to issue commands at this particular vessel. Commander Stefan kind of like really didn't want to make it part of the mission, but yet bottom line, he wound up doing it. But he said, yes, let's go ahead and do it if you can find a Coast Guard cutter that's available for the mission. Well, he did find one. It was the Point Orient. The Lieutenant Saunders is the skipper of that patrol boat. They were in the process of painting the inside of it, but he decided that he'd take the mission, but he wasn't told what the mission was. He just has, we have an urgent mission, you know, are your men capable? Is your boat ready? Yes, okay. So the last unit in this operation was going to be a swift boat. But which one? It couldn't be determined because it would only be able to be determined as the trawler made its approach inland, and then whatever boat was in that area. Because the year before, as a matter of fact, before we came to Vietnam, there had been one trawler that landed along the shore north of Mui Batangan, the Batangan Peninsula. So there was more speculation that it would be in our area. And that's when Mr. Bergen volunteered us for that mission. So that particular day, we went out on July the 14th on our patrol. And we were in our call sign was Same Drink Delta November. Our patrol areas out of Chulai were the Same Drink call signs. Charlie, Same Drink Charlie, Same Drink Delta, Delta November, Same Drink Echo. The Delta November patrol had the mouth of the Saki River in the center of its patrol area. It was just to the north of the peninsula and to the south, all the way up to the San Tra Cook River, which is the river going into Quang Ngai. And so we continued our patrolling, and I'd say about maybe noontime, after we were having lunch or whatever it was, I got a coded message. And that Mr. Bergen, in his book bag, in his satchel, he had a decoding device that we had to decode the message. And it was basically a message indicating that we were part of a intercept plan, a task force, a special group. And it was coming from an individual codename Impair. And as a matter of fact, when the message came over the radio, Same Drink Delta November, this is Impair, blah, blah, blah. And they had to challenge us to make sure that we were who we were. And when that was taken care of, after Mr. Bergen finished the radio communications with him, he called somebody else up on a smaller radio we had, says, who the hell is Impair? No, he didn't know. And Impair comes on with the regular radio, and he basically says that we're in conflict with regulations. His dialogue, his radio communications were not appropriate. So he was kind of like in trouble, but he didn't know who Impair was. Eventually, we found out that it was the commander, Commander Stefan, the big boss in Da Nang. And so messages continued coming, establishing the position of it identified us as a particular vessel in play. It gave us positions. We were behind the trawler. We were supposed to be, it's going to be like a V shape. The trawler was leading the way towards shore. We were behind the trawler on the starboard side. The Coast Guard cutter was on the port side behind it, and then outside of that was the destroyer, the Wilhoit, and the gunboat, the Gallop. Well, nothing could be done until the trawler crossed the 12-mile territorial limit line of South Vietnam. It had to be inside the 12-mile limit. When it went beyond the 12-mile limit, then Commander Stefan, who is now aboard the Wilhoit, he was transferred out to it. He gave the order to the Coast Guard cutter, the Point Orient, to begin broadcasting give up your arms message. So the cutter pulled close enough to the vessel that they could blast those messages. And loud enough, they had 2 sets of speakers. So they heard it, but they ignored it. The trawler continued. The trawler continued. So as we got closer to shore, we were ordered by Impair to fire warning shots across the trawler's bow. It was definitely an enemy vessel. We were about to engage an enemy vessel. That's when the adrenaline starts pumping, because when you know that we're shooting at a target, they're possibly going to shoot back. But you carry out your duty. I was standing in the pilot house next to the boat officer. The boat officer was sitting in an elevated chair at the helm, and there was like maybe 1.5 feet so to the bottom of the inside of the pilot house. And I was watching the radar. It says, Bean, keep an eye on the radar. Make sure not, there was a hazardous flat rock, we called it, out to sea from the river mouth. Very, very dangerous, because there wasn't any buoy or anything close to it. It was an outcrop of a rock, very hazardous. And we wanted to make sure that we didn't run into it. The seas had been calm up to then, but as we got closer to shore, the seas picked up, and we were starting to pick up echoes from the waves, and pretty soon the trawler was lost. Eventually, and this is interesting because in doing my research for the book that I'm writing, that I've written rather, I was able to get my hands on the actual tape recording of the communications between all the vessels. The man that had the psychological warfare speakers on board the Point Orient, he started tape recording all the communications. After they stopped sending the message out, he started recording the communications. And I've got it clearly where my boat officer calls out to Impair, says, I've got one fast-moving contact moving fast towards the river mouth, request permission to go, get him. And Lieutenant J.G. Saunders on the Coast Guard cut of the Point Orient, he says, affirmative, Delta November, that's your band, let's go get him. And Mr. Bergen, I clearly remember, just gives me chills, he says, Roger, I'm on my way. And so sure enough, we started going after it, and the trawler was in front of us, and we were behind her on this side. Eventually, we moved our way to the trawler's port aft side, and we started firing our machine guns. Bob Middleton, the gunner up in the gun tub, he opened up, and it was brutal. And sure enough, soon enough, we started receiving fire from the trawler as well. There were helicopter units from Chulai that were providing illumination rounds as well. And they requested that, because we had been firing our mortar for illumination, and we didn't know that the helicopter units were above us. We didn't know. And our illumination wasn't working quite well where it should have been. It was the darkness of the moon, as a matter of fact. The trawler knew what was going on, and they came in after the darkness of the moon. So we engaged the trawler somewhere around maybe 15 minutes after midnight on the 15th of July. So the trawler kept firing at us, and we fired at it, and as we got closer, Mr. Bergen ordered the boatswain mate, Carver, and our engineman, Reinhardt, to trigger fire. We were that close. We were getting real close to the trawler to hand load a round of high explosive, HE, 81 millimeter mortar, and fire it. And the tape recording I have has Mr. Saunders on the cutter, on the Coast Guard cutter, saying that he fired that one a little bit low. He missed his mark, and sure enough, it had landed in the water and exploded. And so we continued firing machine guns. And meanwhile, again, Mr. Bergen tells the fantail to load a white phosphorus round, and we called it a Willie Peter round. And he did, hand loaded it, and trigger fired it. And this time Carver took accurate aim. And the trawler is here and we're here. He fired the 81 millimeter mortar round into the trawler's pilot house. That caused a bright glowing white flame, and it ran aground. The trawler lost control and ran aground at the mouth of the Saki River. at the tip of the peninsula, Batangan Peninsula. And we still kept getting fire from the vessel. At this time, we were within 75 yards of the vessel, exchanging gunfire. We circled back and crossed over to the starboard side behind the trawler and continued our firing. This enraged the folks on the USS Gallup because they wanted to continue, start firing on the vessel with their gun mounts. And he was told that not to, because I remember the communications. He's complaining to Impera because we can't fire because that swift's in the way. So that's proof enough that we were just toe to toe with the trawler. Eventually, all things. Of course, the Point Orient was heavily involved in it as well, firing it from its position. Finally, all settled. We got the word to pull back because the Korean Marines, the Blue Dragons, they claimed that area was theirs. And if the trawler landed in their area, that trawler now was theirs. And so they were threatening with artillery rounds to the mouth of the river to keep us away, because it was their trophy. Long story short, comes daybreak, and of course we had already expended all of our ammo. We were dry. So at daybreak we headed back to port, and so did the Wilhoit. I believe the gunboat, the Gallup, they stayed around as well, and the destroyer, the Wilhoit, they also stayed because Commander Stefan was still there. But we headed back. We got to Chulai right before getting into the harbor there, around Rosemary Point, entering the channel. Mr. Bergen say, "Bean, get me the broom." What does he want the broom for? I gave him the broom. He went up on the top of the cabin behind the gun tub where the radar mast was, and he secured that broom to the radar mast. It was a clean sweep. There's a reference in war somewhere that some victor in a war in the high seas did the same thing. So Mr. Bergen knows his history, and that's what that reference was. It was a clean sweep. And all the Swifties that were in port that morning were all waiting for us at the pier with cases of beer, and it was a big celebration. It was that was a great day for us. No one was hurt on our side. We received about maybe 3 or 4 slugs on our boat. We did get hit, but nothing serious. And Admiral Veth, the commander of naval forces in Vietnam, he came to Chulai along with, I believe, Captain Cho. He was the commander of naval forces of the South Vietnamese Navy. They came up to Chulai to view. More than 90 tons of ammunition was unloaded at Chulai once the trawler was taken to Chulai. And so it was a thrill to see these people there at the pier, at the Deepwater Pier. Later on, we received word from Da Nang. Mr. Bergen told us to get ready, that we were heading to Da Nang for an award ceremony that was being planned. We were told to get our dress whites, our uniforms, our dress whites, and so that's all we were told. So on the 19th in Da Nang, there was a huge celebration next to the City Hall Pier. We found out that they had taken the trawler and cleaned it up best they could. It was a burnt carcass, the burnt remains of the steel hull vessel. They had the anti-aircraft guns amidship. They had them there, a machine gun on the fantail behind the pilot house. And so we're all lined up. And interestingly enough, it was a award ceremony. I wondered why there's that many military men being decorated or congratulated or whatever. There were Koreans, there were South Vietnamese, there were a few U.S. Navy and Army, and I just didn't know what was going on. Turns out sirens are heard from a distance, and the streets were lined with children and men, and it was Premier Key who had come up to personally congratulate us and decorate us, along with Chief of State Nguyen Van Tu. So there we were, and they had, of course, several things to say. And of course, Key and Tu, I believe, were taking advantage of the situation because it was about the time that the elections were coming up in South Vietnam. So I'm sure it had to do a little PR work in there. Nonetheless, to be decorated by the Chief of State, it was an honor and a privilege that I'll never forget. It was just amazing. It was a thrill. I'll never forget that. That was the greatest day I think I've had in memory of Vietnam. This happened July 15th, July 19th, in that time frame. After that, our patrols got boring. It was really, it's like, what do you do now? you know? But we continued our mission, checking junks day after day, day after day. And it grew monotonous. But on December the 6th was a very black day for our crew and our division in Chu Lai. We were assigned a psychological warfare mission in the same area where we captured the trawler. And we had a PSYOPs team, 2 Army types with speakers, loudspeakers, and a tape. It's a spooky tape in Vietnamese. Wandering Soul, I believe it's called, where this individual, and you hear some wailing in the background, agonizing wailing. It was morbid, very, very awful. But it talks to the enemy soldier. It tells them, you need to go back to your homeland. You need to go back north because your family is waiting for you there. You know, what if you die here? Supposedly there's a myth or something that your soul will wander forever if you're not buried in your homeland, according to their culture, their traditions. And so this, of course, I didn't know that at the time. But in researching it, that's what I've come to find out. Now it makes sense, all that wailing, that intimidation. Well, it worked because, let me back up a moment. This is something very important. We broke for lunch off of the mouth of the Son Tra Cook. As I mentioned, it's the river leading into Quang Nai. And as we're sitting off, we went off and just put the engines on neutral and just kind of floated along with the waves. There was a lumbering albatross that approached us from the south. And as it reached our boat, it circled our boat twice. And then it went off and sat on the ocean, no more than 30 yards away from us. And the boatswain, he was a salty sailor. The boatswain had 15, 18 years of service already. Tattoos, the naked lady that he could make her dance with, doing his biceps, and the sparrows on his chest, the tattooed chain on his wrist, his son, his new son, Kevin, on his arm as well. A true salty sailor. He told Mr. Bergen, it's not good. He says, this isn't a good sign. Later I found out, Mr. Bergen tells me that there's a book, I believe, something about the Ancient Mariner, the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. And it talks about the albatross flies the seas looking for sailors, the souls of sailors, dead sailors. And so they spend their time over the ocean looking for the souls of dead sailors. And that's why the boatswain just didn't like it. He knew the story, knew the myth. So on our second journey, we approached the river mouth of the Son Tra Cook, and we turned to the right, or is going north towards the Batangan Peninsula. And that's the My Lai shoreline as well. There are three small villages, hamlets, little hamlets next to each other, side by side. The Kole, Kole 1, Kole 2, Kole 3. One boat officer, Mr. Bob Bolger, he codenamed that area the Kole Corral. He had a firefight there, quite brutal firefight there, and he always told be careful. Well, so we passed Kole 1 and the broadcasting begins, nothing, and past Kole 2 and still nothing. Twin 50s are pointing towards the beach. The gunner's looking at binoculars down the coast, and the boatswain Carver, he's behind the single 50 and the fantail. And we've got other individuals with machine guns and AR-15s and so on, pointing towards the beach. Mr. Bergen, by the way, is on the fantail. Our engineman was a replacement engineman, Jim Snyder, engineman, third class Jim Snyder, who was taking the place of our engineman Reinhardt, who was on R&R, I believe in the Philippines. And so he's driving the boat. Schneider is driving the boat, and I'm in the pilot house with him, looking at the radar, making sure and looking at the fathometer, making sure we've got enough water clearance at the bottom. And I've got earphones, little speaking system, and so does the gunner on the pilot house, and so does the boatswain Carver on the fantail. And Middleton in the gun tub tells Carver in the fantail, say, hey, I've got a subject on the beach up ahead. Says, where's he at? And then he figured out, no, I better not tell him, because if I tell him where he's at, he's liable to tell the boat officer and he wants to stop, and it didn't look good to the gunner up there. Something's wrong, something's very suspicious here, it's too quiet. No activity on the beach, nothing. Nobody's out from their hamlets, nothing. Their hooches, nothing. And Mr. Bergen was in front and off to one side of the aftermount. He had gotten a .30 caliber machine gun, and we had mounted it on the stanchions on the port side. Well, Carver convinced Middleton to tell him exactly where. And so Carver found the individual, one man, black pajamas, Vietnamese cone hat, just standing right at the top ridge of the sand dune. And as we continue moving forward, as we're passing Kole 2, we get opened up with 3 ambush positions from the beach, forward, midship, and behind us. I saw a line of rounds kicking up sand, and then water, just like you see in the movies. It was coming straight for the pilot house. The last thing I remember was a bang. The last round that individual fired hit the frame, the window frame, right in front of us. Not in the middle, just right on the top edge of it. Broke through the metal frame, gasket, window, gasket, and metal frame, and dropped right in front of us on the dash. It threw me back. I got up, and the engineman asked me if I was okay. Everything was fine. And before long, I heard gunner say, because we couldn't hear the machine gun in the back firing. And then gunner made the observation that, boatswain was hit. He got hit. And so Carver and Schneider and Reinhardt, the 3 of them, were very, very close, drinking buddies, basically. And so Schneider and Bergen, Mr. Bergen, at the same time hit the starter engines, because our engines went dead, because Schneider and Mr. Bergen attempted to put the throttles down and hard. Schneider in the pilot house, Mr. Bergen on the after controls, because we had after steering as well. In so doing, they put too much fuel into the engines, and the engines went dead. So but it took, I guess maybe 20 seconds or so or less, felt longer, but Schneider eventually got the engines going. He pushed forward gently and took us out to sea, and then told me to take the boat out to sea, and he was going to go back to the fantail as he was going on. The front windshield was shattered in front of me. I had to stand off to one side and steer that way because you couldn't see out the front. It was just totally shattered. And the anger just got to me. I wanted to see what was going on back there. I looked ahead, and I couldn't see any interference, no fishing boats, nothing out ahead of us. So, call it my immature. I was 21 years old already. Yes, I had just turned 21 in November. Still, I considered immaturity, stupidness, I don't know, stupidity. I put the swift boat on automatic, if you will, and I ran out the pilot house and to the back. And I stopped right at the back edge of the cabin, of the swift boat cabin. And I saw Carver laying there in a pool of blood and machine gun cases everywhere. I just froze. I was in shock. And then the anger kicked in. And Mr. Bergen saw me that I was there, and he says, Bean, get back to the pilot house, take us out, call medevac. And so I shook it off a little bit, and I went to the pilot house, and I called what they call flash traffic. Flash traffic, you call it out, flash traffic. And that means that you're going to just break all sorts of regulations and tell people where you're at. We needed a medevac chopper, a dust-off, to come in to our rescue. Well, we had a whip antenna. On our radio whip antenna was too high to have a helicopter even attempt to hover on the back, on the aft of our swift boat. So I radioed the destroyer that was out in our area, and they started coming towards us, and we went out to sea towards it. I called in for medevac, a dust-off chopper, and got that going. And once I got all that information going and told the destroyer that we were heading out and they were coming towards us, I went back out again. But I grabbed my M79 grenade launcher and I loaded it, and I went to the fantail and I fired off a round. And that startled Mr. Bergen, and Schneider was already cradling Carver, and his shirt was all drenched in blood, and Carver was just nothing there. The anger just continued, and Bergen yelled at me and screamed at me, what are you doing? I loaded another round and fired away, and I just had to release my anger. I was so, if I could have walked on the water I wanted to go out and reach that person and just tear his heart out. It just overwhelmed me. And so that's the worst day that I had in Vietnam. We had a memorial service for Carver. Before that, of course, we took Carver up to the destroyer. We came alongside. They hoisted a basket down to us, and medics came down and hoisted him up. And then the dust-off chopper hovered over the fantail of the destroyer and then picked him up and took him over. And we headed back to Chulai. And as we did, they were in the process of loading him up on the destroyer. And as they did, the helicopter flew over us and just kind of like toggled their wings from one side to the other. I took it as a sign of, Carver telling us goodbye, So that was the most unfortunate time for us. Traumatic, very traumatic. Mm. And as a matter of fact, his spirit is the one that, pardon me, his spirit haunted me. I'll be honest to say, his spirit haunted me for many, many years after I came back. Back to the States, I thought that I worked for an engineering company on a survey crew and then a draftsman. Finally got my draftsman job. Was married, had 2 children, and I'd see veterans on the streets, and some of them were scruffy, and I thought they were really affected by war, and maybe I'd seen a lot more than I had. So I felt fortunate. I thought that I came back sane, everything was good for me, and I thank God that I was okay. But eventually, I started having difficulty taking showers. I couldn't go to even to go to the bathroom. I didn't want to close the door because I feel Carver's presence around me. And to be honest, I would go out. I would go days without taking a shower because I couldn't draw the curtain because I felt his body around me, and I knew that if I opened my eyes, I would see his face, his bloody face in front of me. And in those times, you couldn't share those things with anyone. So I just held that in all along. But I continued to be in denial. I worked my way through it and just continued trying to convince myself that I was okay. But the incidents continued. It wasn't until my wife's grandmother, all her family is from Greece, an island in Greece called Limnos, Greece. She paid for all of us to go to the homeland in Greece. And while I was there, I was near a village called Varos, I believe, along the shoreline in that island of Lemnos. And I had my son Anthony and in a little umbrella stroller, and we were playing with a little sand crab. We had a blanket. I went away from the family. They had a big Greek feast at the little village there. And I sat there and I saw the there was a fishing boat, very similar to the junks, Vietnamese junks that we inspected. And of course the flashbacks came, and of course the feelings and things of Carver came back. And I started wondering, well, what's going on? You know, why does he keep haunting me this way? I mean, maybe he wants me to share the story of what we accomplished. Maybe he wants me to convey to his family that his death wasn't in vain, that because of his accuracy on that mortar, on that 15th of July, 1967 day, he took down that enemy ship. I mean, it was a shot, whether by chance or whatever it was, he did it. And more than 90 tons of ammunition and supplies were kept from enemy hands. How many Free World Forces lives were saved because of what he did? A true hero. And maybe he wanted me to share that story, to tell the swift boat story and what brave sailors did on those tiny boats. And so when I came home, I told my mother about it, and she grabbed a shoebox full of letters that I had written to them. I put them in chronological date order, and the last letter I wrote to them was 79. That's my boat number, 79. I started getting the chronology of the Vietnam War during that time frame, April 67 to April of 68. The chronology of current events in the United States, merging them together. I prepared an outline. I didn't consider myself capable of writing a book, but the drive took me toward that end. at least trying to figure out if that's what he wants me to do. Maybe it's real, you know. He's really contacted me. He wants me to do it. Who am I not to follow his orders? You know? And so when I actually started writing the first lines, those incidents in the shower stopped. And I haven't had them since. I haven't had them since.
That's amazing.
So it's all coming full circle, you know, full circle, and so again, you know, I stayed in denial about all these things that were happening to me. I was fortunate after years, the Swiftboat veterans started connecting with each other. And there was a organization formed, the Swiftboat Sailors Association. I was invited to be a board director early on, and there was a big celebration in Washington, D.C. at the Navy Museum.
The memorial or at the Navy Yard?
At the
Downtown?
Navy Yard. At the
Okay.
Navy Yard, there was a dedication. PCF 1 and PCF 2 were found in Panama and brought back to the United States and refurbished. And PCF 1 is at the Navy Museum at the Navy Yard as well. So we gathered, and I became a board member and eventually secretary, and after that vice president. And when our president Tom Forrest passed away, I took over as president and served for a number of years as president. But it's been a long run. Been a long run. I can't believe it's 52 years now. 52
That is
years.
Quite a story.
Yes, sir.
Wow.
And as a matter of fact, you know, every Veterans Day, I think of our brothers. We lost 50. We call them our honor crew, our Swiftboat honor crew. We like saying that they're still on patrol. And so we lost 50 Swiftboat sailors. Not all to combat, interestingly enough, not all to combat. Some of them were accidents. Some of them were accidental drownings. We had a number of Swiftboats that were capsized during the monsoon up in Hawaii. It's a very, very difficult time for Swiftboats, but it's a strong brotherhood of individuals that we meet every 2 years and share sea stories. They're all true.
Of course they are. Do you look up Carver's name?
Oh yes, when we went to that reunion in '95, when we had the dedication of PCF 1,
Yeah.
we went there, and I've got a website that has information. I've yet to upload the videos to some of those, but yes, there was a matter of fact. Interesting that you mentioned about the Vietnam Wall. The local TV station, the CBS affiliate in Houston, Channel 11, KHOU TV. I was doing a reading of my work in progress at a bookstop. At that time, they were still a bookseller. And they heard about it, and they sent a reporter. And I guess word went further up, and there was a gentleman his name was Sylvan Rodriguez. He had a First Sunday show, a program, and it was dedicated to the minority community in Houston. And they would feature certain individuals, tell their story. So they heard about me, and they invited me for an interview, and I shared my personal film footage and so on, slides that I had. Of course, back then it was Super 8 film and Kodak slides and so on. And they made a wonderful interview of that moment. And then they found out about the 1995 dedication, and they flew up to Washington for that dedication as well. And so there was a second interview airing by that channel as well. And I hope to soon be able to load that up to the website as well. I don't know much of the details, but I know that they're collecting pictures and interviews and oral histories as well. And I know Mr. Galloway is very much involved in that. And so, yes, I'm pleased to be part of it. Very pleased, very honored to be part of it. Thank you for the opportunity to share my story. Thank you very much.
We're very grateful. We're very grateful. So this is the Vietnam War commemorations pin. In World War II, all the veterans got what they call the ruptured duck, which was a little pin for all the veterans of World War II.
Okay.
That Joe always says that his 5 uncles and father and everyone who had one of those, you couldn't get elected dog catcher in America in 1946 if you didn't have one. So we made one for you guys, and it has the eagle on the front, and on the back it says, "A grateful nation thanks and honors you."
Oh, wonderful.
And so our job is just to welcome you home.
Thank you.
And thank you for your service, and for doing your duty, and for all the goodness that has come from it. So there we are.
I'm official now.
You are official. You are a
Right. Thank you so much.
wonderful
Thank
pleasure
you for the
and
opportunity.
privilege.
It's a pleasure meeting you. You as well.